Syria, officially known as the Syrian Arab Republic, is a country located in the Middle East, bordering Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and the Mediterranean Sea. It has a long and rich history, with the earliest known settlements dating back to ancient civilizations. Syria is often considered the cradle of many early human civilizations, including the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Phoenicians. Its ancient cities, such as Damascus and Aleppo, are among the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. These cities in the region played critical roles in the development of trade, culture, and religion throughout history. Syria was also the site of important historical events and was once part of the Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman empires. Its location in the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and Europe made it a prime area for trade and cultural exchange. However, the modern history of Syria has been marred by conflict. Following its independence from French colonial rule in 1946, Syria experienced a series of political changes, including multiple coups and short-lived republics. In 1970, Hafez al-Assad took control of the country through a coup and established an authoritarian regime that would dominate the country for several decades. Under Hafez's rule, Syria became a secular state with a strong military presence, but its government was also characterized by a high level of repression. Upon his death in 2000, his son, Bashar al-Assad, succeeded him. Bashar's initial promise of political and economic reform was met with enthusiasm, but the country's political system remained largely unchanged, and the regime continued its tight control over the population. In 2011, Syria was swept into the Arab Spring, a series of protests and uprisings across the Middle East. Initially, protests calling for democratic reforms were largely peaceful, but they quickly escalated as the government responded with violent repression. The Assad regime's violent crackdown on protesters led to widespread disillusionment and the rise of armed opposition groups. Over time, the conflict escalated into a full-scale civil war, with various factions, including the Assad government, Kurdish forces, Sunni rebel groups, Islamist militants, and foreign actors, all involved in the fighting. The war in Syria has been characterized by brutal violence, widespread human rights abuses, and the use of chemical weapons. The Assad regime, with the backing of Russia and Iran, has conducted numerous airstrikes, including attacks on civilian infrastructure such as hospitals, schools, and markets. Rebel groups, including extremist factions like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, have also committed atrocities, including massacres, beheadings, and bombings. The humanitarian crisis in Syria has been catastrophic, with millions of Syrians displaced, both internally and externally, as refugees. According to the United Nations, more than 400,000 people have died as a result of the conflict, and millions more have been injured or left homeless. The war has drawn in international powers, with the United States and European nations supporting various rebel factions, while Russia and Iran have provided substantial military and political support to the Assad regime. This international involvement has further complicated the conflict, as various factions often have conflicting interests, leading to proxy battles and diplomatic standoffs. One of the most notable events of the war was the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which seized large parts of Syria and Iraq in 2014. ISIS's brutal tactics and its self-declared caliphate pose a global threat, prompting military intervention from the U.S.-led coalition. Syria's infrastructure has been severely damaged throughout the war, with entire cities reduced to rubble. The economy has also been decimated, with widespread unemployment, inflation, and food shortages. The country's healthcare and education systems, once some of the most developed in the region, have collapsed. Despite the horrors of war, Syria's rich cultural heritage has been targeted by extremists and belligerents alike, with many of its ancient sites, including Palmyra, suffering extensive damage. In 2019, ISIS was largely defeated in Syria, but the war continued, with Assad's forces gradually regaining control over most of the country. However, significant areas remain under control of Kurdish forces in the north, and parts of the country are still controlled by rebel factions. The humanitarian situation remains dire, and the prospect for political resolution to the conflict appear uncertain. Efforts at peace talks, including those in Geneva and Astana, have largely failed to produce a lasting resolution, and the violence continues to affect millions of Syrians. The war in Syria has had profound consequences, not only for the country itself but for the broader Middle East and international politics. It has highlighted the complexities of modern warfare, where various armed groups, foreign powers, and ideological movements are intertwined. It has also exposed the limitations of international diplomacy and the challenges of addressing regional conflicts with global implications. While the future of Syria remains uncertain, the ongoing conflict and its human toll continue to shape the geopolitical landscape of the region. The Syrian conflict has also had significant implications for the wider Middle Eastern region. Neighboring countries, such as Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, have been heavily impacted by the crisis, as they have hosted millions of refugees fleeing the violence. Lebanon, already struggling with its own political and economic instability, has faced additional strain with the influx of Syrians. Turkey had become a key player in the conflict, supporting rebel groups opposed to Assad while simultaneously managing a large refugee population. The Syrian civil war has also sparked a resurgence of sectarianism in the region, as Sunni Shia tensions have deepened, with the Assad regime being supported by Shia-majority Iran and its allied groups, while many of the opposition factions are Sunni-dominated. This sectarian divide has had reverberations across the Middle East, complicating an already complex network of alliances and rivalries. Furthermore, the war has led to the growing influence of non-state actors and armed groups. Groups such as Hezbollah, a Lebanese militia backed by Iran, have played an instrumental role in supporting Assad's regime. On the other hand, various rebel factions, including Islamist extremist groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham (HTS), have sought to establish control over certain regions. The conflict has allowed jihadist ideologies to spread, creating a breeding ground for radicalization. Even after the fall of ISIS's caliphate, its ideology continues to inspire groups and individuals around the world. The role of foreign intervention has been another defining aspect of the conflict. Russia's involvement, which began in 2015 with airstrikes in support of the Assad regime, has been a game-changer in favor of the government. Russia has provided critical military aid, from aircraft and artillery to military advisors and special forces. The Russian government has also used its position to bolster Assad's diplomatic standing on the world stage, particularly within the United Nations Security Council, where it has vetoed several resolutions aimed at pressuring the regime. Iran, another key ally of Assad, has also provided significant military and financial support, sending fighters and military advisors to assist. The economic situation will be another key determinant of Syria's future. With international sanctions still in place and the country's financial resources stretched thin, the ability to create an economy capable of supporting the population remains uncertain. The sanctions, which are aimed at curbing the Assad regime's access to funds, have severely restricted Syria's ability to rebuild its economy. They have also created a reliance on external actors like Iran and Russia, but these countries have their own interests and limitations, which may prevent long-term solutions. Therefore, Syria's path to recovery depends not only on the lifting of sanctions, but also on the creation of a stable economic framework that can support both short-term recovery and long-term growth. The return of displaced Syrians could potentially offer a much-needed labor force, but without jobs and a functional economy, these individuals may have little choice but to stay in exile. The issue of accountability and justice remains another sensitive topic in post-war Syria. Many Syrians are calling for accountability for war crimes committed during the conflict, including those perpetrated by both the Assad regime and various opposition groups. There is a growing demand for justice, and international courts and organizations are investigating human rights abuses and war crimes. However, the Syrian government, with its continued control over much of the country, has shown little willingness to allow investigations or trials. The issue of justice becomes particularly difficult because of the deeply entrenched political and military power held by Assad and his allies. Without addressing these issues of accountability, it is hard to imagine a genuine peace that brings healing to the Syrian people. Moreover, political reconciliation will be a complex and long-term process. Any future peace agreement will need to bring together diverse factions, including the government, opposition groups, ethnic minorities, and other stakeholders. However, the divisions in Syrian society are deep, and years of war have entrenched mistrust between groups. For instance, Sunni Arabs, who make up the majority of the population, have largely opposed Assad's rule, while Alawite, Druze, and Christian minorities have often supported him for fear of being marginalized by the opposition. The Kurds, who have fought for greater autonomy in northern Syria, have also sought a seat at the table. Any lasting peace will have to include all these groups, and this will require a great deal of negotiation, trust building, and compromise, factors that remain difficult in Syria's current political climate. The role of regional powers, such as Turkey, Iran, and Israel, will also continue to impact Syria's future. The Turkish government, which has supported various opposition groups and conducted military operations in northern Syria, remains wary of the Kurdish autonomy project and its potential to embolden separatist movements within Turkey. As such, Turkey will likely seek to maintain a level of influence in northern Syria. Similarly, Iran's strategic alliance with the Assad regime has not only been motivated by ideological ties but also by geopolitical interests in maintaining a corridor to Hezbollah in Lebanon. As a result, Iran is unlikely to withdraw from Syria without assurances of its regional influence. Israel, on the other hand, remains concerned about Iranian entrenchment in Syria, particularly along its borders, and will continue to monitor the situation closely, carrying out airstrikes on suspected Iranian positions. These regional dynamics make the path to peace even more complicated, as the interests of neighboring countries often clash with Syria's internal needs. The Syrian refugee crisis is another immense challenge that will require attention in the coming years. The millions of Syrians displaced both internally and externally are scattered across the globe, with many living in temporary and overcrowded conditions in countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and European nations. The return of refugees is a politically sensitive issue, with many refugees hesitant to return due to fears of persecution or reprisal from the Assad regime. Additionally, the lack of basic services in Syria means that returning refugees might not find the stability and safety they are seeking. For those who do return, the challenge of reintegration into a post-war society will be enormous. They may face discrimination, social stigma, and difficulty in finding housing, jobs, or access to healthcare and education. One of the critical elements in Syria's eventual recovery will be the involvement of the international community. While the UN and other international bodies have provided some humanitarian aid, much more will be needed to support the country in its rebuilding process. Humanitarian aid will be crucial in the short term, as many Syrians still face food insecurity, inadequate housing, and a lack of medical care. However, long-term solutions require more than just humanitarian assistance. They will involve fostering a political environment conducive to peace, as well as the rebuilding of institutions, infrastructure, and governance systems. The international community will have to play a role in providing both the financial and technical support needed to rebuild the country, while also pressuring all parties to engage in meaningful dialogue for lasting peace. Syria's potential for recovery will also depend on its people. Despite the immense hardships, the Syrian population has shown resilience throughout the war. Civilians have rebuilt their communities in the face of incredible adversity, and civil society organizations have worked tirelessly to provide aid, education, and support. The future of Syria may very well rest on the ability of its people to come together, heal from the trauma of war, and build a new, inclusive society. The road to peace and reconstruction will be long and fraught with challenges, but it is not impossible. A peaceful, stable, and prosperous Syria will require a concerted effort from both Syrians and the international community. In conclusion, Syria's future remains uncertain, and the path to peace and reconstruction is fraught with difficulties. The damage caused by the war, both physical and psychological, is immense, and the challenges of rebuilding the country are vast. Political, economic, and social divisions persist, making any lasting solution to the conflict elusive. However, the possibility of recovery and peace exists, and with international support, political reconciliation, and a commitment to justice, Syria may one day rebuild from the ashes of war. The road ahead is long, but hope remains for a better future for Syria and its people. With its mix of ethnic and religious groups, has seen deepening divisions. The conflict has exacerbated sectarian and ethnic tensions, creating significant mistrust between different communities. For example, the war has particularly affected Syria's Kurdish population, who have sought autonomy in the north and face persecution from both the Assad regime and Turkey. While Kurdish forces have played a crucial role in the fight against ISIS, their future remains uncertain in post-conflict Syria, with competing interests from regional and international powers. Similarly, the Alawite minority, to which the Assad family belongs, has been central to the regime's survival, but their position in a post-war Syria could be contentious, especially if political reforms or power-sharing arrangements come to the fore. The massive loss of life and the destruction of families have also had a long-lasting impact on Syrian society. Trauma and psychological scars are pervasive, with millions of people, particularly children, living with the memories of violence, displacement, and loss. The emotional and mental toll of the war will likely affect the country for generations, leading to higher rates of mental health issues, such as PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Rebuilding social cohesion will require not just physical reconstruction, but also efforts to heal the deep emotional wounds that war has inflicted on the Syrian people. Furthermore, the ongoing displacement crisis continues to exacerbate Syria's problems. With millions of refugees scattered across the region and beyond, the return of displaced persons remains a complex issue. Some refugees are reluctant to return to Syria due to fear of retaliation from the Assad regime or concerns about the lack of basic services and security. Others are prevented from returning by the ongoing fighting or the threat of being caught in the crossfire. Countries hosting large numbers of Syrian refugees, like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, have struggled with the economic and social pressure supporting refugees, leading to calls for greater international support and burden sharing. For those still within Syria, life remains incredibly difficult. Even in areas that have been liberated or retaken by Assad's forces, the situation is far from stable. Many areas remain lawless, with banditry, extortion, and violence continuing to plague communities. The war economy, driven by illegal trade, smuggling, and war profiteering, has also led to widespread corruption, further undermining the potential for rebuilding the country in a transparent and fair manner. Reconstruction, too, remains a distant goal. The government, backed by Russia and Iran, has begun efforts to rebuild certain areas, particularly in the cities that have been retaken from opposition forces. However, without significant international support, these efforts will be slow and incomplete. There are no guarantees that Assad will succeed in fully reconstructing the country or that the international community will assist in a way that benefits all Syrians equally. The lack of political resolution and continued economic hardship means that the war's aftermath could persist long after the conflict officially ends. Politically, the situation remains fluid. Assad has consolidated power over much of the country, but his grip on Syria is still contested in several regions. The opposition, fractured and weakened, lacks the ability to present a coherent alternative to the current regime, but many Syrians remain dissatisfied with Assad's rule. The Syrian people, particularly those who oppose the regime, have been marginalized, and any hope for a meaningful political transition appears slim. The international community, meanwhile, continues to call for political reforms and greater democracy, but those demands have largely been ignored by the Assad regime. The future of Syria remains uncertain. While the Assad regime may have survived, the country is deeply divided, and its people are suffering. Despite the defeat of ISIS and the recapture of much of the territory, the broader conflict has left Syria in ruins, both physically and socially. The humanitarian crisis continues, and any reconstruction efforts are overshadowed by the political and economic challenges that lie ahead. International diplomatic efforts have so far failed to bring about a comprehensive resolution, and the situation remains a complex and tragic case of modern warfare with no clear path to peace. Syria's eventual recovery, if it is to happen, will require an unprecedented effort from both domestic actors and the international community. This would involve not only rebuilding infrastructure and providing humanitarian aid, but also addressing the deeply entrenched political divisions and the needs of the displaced population. Ultimately, the future of Syria depends on the ability of its people and the international community to find common ground and work together toward a future of peace, stability, and dignity for all Syrians. As the future of Syria unfolds, there are critical issues that will shape the country's potential recovery and the prospect of peace. The immense destruction of infrastructure, including roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, and housing, has left many parts of Syria in ruins. The sheer scale of rebuilding required poses a significant challenge. Yet, the war has also created a unique set of opportunities for international involvement, with the possibility of new, large-scale reconstruction projects supported by regional and global actors. However, The effectiveness of these efforts hinges on the political dynamics within Syria itself, and whether the Assad regime is willing to share power or allow meaningful reforms that could pave a way for a more inclusive society. In the war effort, this Iranian presence has been viewed as a threat by regional powers such as Israel, which has launched numerous airstrikes on Iranian military targets within Syria. The U.S. and its coalition partners have supported various opposition groups, including the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, which played a crucial role in the defeat of ISIS. However, the U.S. has been criticized for its inconsistent policy towards Syria. At times, the U.S. has engaged in direct military action, including airstrikes on Syrian government forces and the destruction of chemical weapons sites, while at other times, it has pulled back, leaving local forces to contend with a shifting balance of power on the ground. The Turkish government's role in Syria has been particularly complex. While initially supportive of the opposition groups, Turkey later launched several military operations against Kurdish forces in northern Syria, fearing that Kurdish militias aligned with the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, which Turkey considers a terrorist organization, would establish an autonomous region. These operations have caused significant tensions with the U.S., which had supported Kurdish fighters in the battle against ISIS. Turkey's actions in Syria have further complicated the situation, creating new front lines and refugee flows while exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. Syria's regional alliances have also shifted over the years. While initially isolated by many Arab nations due to its close ties with Iran and its involvement in regional conflicts, such as in Lebanon and Iraq, the Assad regime has recently sought to mend ties with some of its neighbors. In 2020, Syria's relations with the United Arab Emirates, UAE, and other Gulf states began to warm, signaling potential shifts in the Arab world's stance on the conflict. Nonetheless, Assad's return to the Arab League has not been universally accepted, and many countries, particularly in the West, continue to call for his removal, citing his role in the brutal suppression of the opposition and the humanitarian crisis. Despite the ongoing violence, some areas of Syria have seen partial stabilization. In regions where Assad's forces have regained control, there have been attempts at reconstruction and efforts to restore services, although this has been hampered by the economic sanctions imposed on Syria by the United States and the European Union. The sanctions, which are designed to pressure the regime to engage in meaningful political reforms, have also made it difficult for the country to recover economically. In the north, Kurdish-controlled areas have formed a de facto autonomous region, which has complicated Turkey's efforts to reassert control. The Kurdish administration has sought to establish self-rule, but it faces opposition from both Damascus and Ankara. The Turkish government has consistently opposed Kurdish autonomy in Syria, seeing it as a threat to its territorial integrity, and has conducted military operations to curb Kurdish influence. The international community has struggled to find a viable solution to the Syrian conflict. Multiple peace initiatives, such as the Geneva talks and the Astana process, have made little progress in establishing a political solution that satisfies all parties. The United Nations has called for a ceasefire and political dialogue, but there is no consensus on the way forward. The United States and other Western powers have expressed a desire for political transition in Syria, while Russia and Iran continue to support Assad's government. The war's devastating impact on Syria's people cannot be overstated. The conflict has displaced over 13 million people, both within Syria and across its borders. Refugees have fled to neighboring countries, including Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Europe. The economic collapse and destruction of infrastructure have made it difficult for those who remain in the country to access basic services like healthcare, education, and clean water. The long-term psychological toll of the war on the Syrian population is incalculable, with millions suffering from trauma and loss. In conclusion, the war in Syria has transformed the country into a symbol of modern warfare's complexity and brutality. It has drawn in multiple foreign powers, created sectarian and ideological rifts, devastated the civilian population, and led to massive human displacement. The war's long duration and evolving nature have made finding a resolution increasingly difficult. While the Assad regime has regained control over much of the country, the conflict is far from over, and the prospects for lasting peace remain uncertain. As Syria continues to grapple with the aftermath of the war, the international community must confront the long-term consequences of the conflict, including the reconstruction of a shattered nation, the repatriation of refugees, and the reconciliation of a deeply divided society. As the conflict in Syria persists, the country faces numerous challenges that extend far beyond the immediate military and political struggles. The long-term effects on the environment, economy, and social fabric are profound, and will require years, if not decades, to fully address. The environmental impact of the war has been significant, with widespread damage to the country's natural resources. Agriculture, once a key part of Syria's economy, has been decimated due to the destruction of farmland, irrigation systems, and livestock. Additionally, the environmental degradation caused by bombings, chemical attacks, and the destruction of industrial sites has left long-lasting damage. Water shortages, compounded by the destruction of infrastructure, pose a further challenge to both the population and agriculture. As Syria tries to rebuild, these environmental challenges will need to be addressed if the country is to have any hope of economic recovery and stability. The economic situation in Syria remains dire. Once a relatively middle-income country with a diverse economy, Syria's economic foundations have been shattered by the war. The country's GDP has dropped significantly, and inflation has soared, making basic goods unaffordable for many people. With sanctions from the U.S. and the European Union, Syria's ability to access international markets, obtain foreign investment, or even rebuild its infrastructure has been severely hampered. While Russia and Iran have provided some economic support, these partnerships come with their own limitations and conditions, and much of Syria's post-war reconstruction will depend on foreign aid and investment. Additionally, Syria faces the ongoing challenge of the spread of diseases and the collapse of its healthcare system. Hospitals and clinics have been heavily damaged in the conflict, and the healthcare system is severely underfunded. While there have been attempts to treat those injured in the war, the ability to provide for non-emergency medical needs, such as vaccinations, maternity care, and chronic illness management, is limited. The COVID-19 pandemic has further compounded these issues, making access to healthcare even more difficult for the Syrian population. Additionally, the war has placed immense strain on Syria's education system. With schools destroyed, teachers displaced, and children affected by trauma, the country faces a lost generation of students who will struggle to rebuild their lives without proper education and opportunities for social mobility. The social fabric of Syria has been torn apart by years of violence. The once heterogeneous society,